For today, I called this Elephantini and Jewish Identity. And before I even get to what I called my goal for the day, I wanted to give you just a little background information. And to some extent, the two-page project that had you look at the chapter in the history before the exile and after the exile kind of sets you up for this. But let me pull out about five or six big dates. And overall, the class isn't about dates, but if you don't get certain details regarding dates, then you kind of won't know what's going on when we get to Elephantini. So the first date that matters, and this may be a little bit of a surprise, it's so far back, is the 722-720 date. And those two dates were the fall of Samaria, the northern kingdom, capital of the northern kingdom, and then the establishment of Assyrian control there. But this is the defeat of Israel. And the reason why the date is important is that you have to ask, what happens to these people? And so after 720, does everybody just keep going to the grocery store and doing their errands and getting their kids from school and life goes on? Or surely there were some huge disruptions. And what were they? The Bible describes some large portion of people being deported to areas in the Assyrian kingdom. Not to Assyria itself, but they just move the population around so they won't be at home. And they move other people from other parts of their empire into this area. But one thing to keep in mind is that some part of those people from Israel must have gone to Judah. And at least I conclude this because the Bible is so full of stories about Israel. And this is where the Israel-Judah framework came in terms of my own book project that's waiting to come out. That Judah somehow inherits a huge pile of lore from Israel, the other kingdom. And for that to happen, you've got to have people from Israel going into Judah. Second date, and again this is kind of a combo date, 597, 586, defeat of Judah. Again, maybe sounds obvious, but the question that affects us is, what happens to these people? What happens to the people of Judah after 586? And again, the Bible says some mass of them get deported to Babylonia. But it's not all of them. And in fact, if you want to read the most detail on this in the Bible, go to a few chapters toward the end of the book of Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah. And we're told that the Babylonians set up a local governor. And Jeremiah kind of sides with this local governor, but then these people come along and they assassinate the Babylonian governor, which turns out not to make the Babylonians very happy. And so they take off, and the place that they go is Egypt, it says. And that's a little backdrop for our Elephantini stuff. And the last thing you hear about Jeremiah himself, in fact, is that he's been dragged off to Egypt with these people that assassinated a guy named Gedaliah, the governor the Babylonians set up. But then there's this question, so after 586, or the first defeat earlier in the 599, 597, after that moment, how many people go to Babylonia? How many people stay in the land? Where else do people go? At least some of them go to Egypt. And what does that mean that they're scattered? Next date, 539. So this is only 50 years later. No, what? Yeah, 50, roughly. So this is when this guy named Cyrus, C-Y-R-U-S, Cyrus, sets up, well, he takes over Babylonia and the Babylonian Empire and sets up what's usually called a Persian Empire. And in some ways, it seems that the King Cyrus initiates new policies toward the people they conquered. And it's probably not true that they're friendlier exactly, but at least in the case of Judah, the Persians could say, well, it wasn't our rebellion. They didn't rebel against us. We're going to manage these people in a different way, still controlling them, but with our own idea of what should work. And in particular, what the Persians seem to do is they encourage the establishment of certain institutions in Jerusalem, which had been the capital. Right? Jerusalem was the capital of Judah, and the Persians set up a province that is usually called in Aramaic, which was the national language, Yehud, Y-E-H-U-D. It's the same word. Judah is Yehudah, and so it simply takes the last ah off. So they, in effect, set up a province of Judah with Jerusalem as the capital, and they say, let them rebuild that temple there. This will be good for us, for the empire. And then eventually let them rebuild the walls, the city walls. We have no problem with Jerusalem as a fortified center, because it'll be our fortified center. And the head of Judah will be our governor, working for us. We're not worried about a rebellion. But in terms of our Elephantine stuff and kind of the backdrop of what happens after the exile, after the fall of Judah, then the arrival of the Persians is a huge thing. Okay, I got a fourth date. 526. Cyrus's son, whose name is Cambyses, or however it should be pronounced, C-A-M-B-Y-S-E-S, Cambyses, conquers Egypt. In 526, the Persians conquer Egypt. And that's going to affect Elephantine, because that's when we're going to get this community. And the Persians hold Egypt till about 400, so about 125 years. If you think about it, this is a long way from the center of Persia, which is in Iran. All the way across Iraq and Syria and sort of Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, all the way down into Africa. This is a big empire at this point, bigger than any of the Assyrian Babylonian ones. Never mind that it reached way further into the east. And I have one more date and then a kind of vague statement about what happens after. So according to the Bible, at least, in about 515, in about 515, a temple is rebuilt at Jerusalem under King Darius, D-A-R-I-U-S, Darius the First. So the reason that ends up being interesting is that it appears there was a temple in Egypt. And so it'd be useful to know how that relates to the temple in Jerusalem. So the last thing just to throw out there by way of background is that the Bible has two books that are oriented to this situation under the Persians. And they're the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And there's a lot of debate about exactly when they were written, how much they really know historically, what kinds of historical sources they had. But they spend some time occupied with the temple rebuilding, especially Ezra, which would be kind of late 6th century, though the text itself is surely later, or at least large parts of it. But also then they're occupied with events that seem to take place in the 5th century, so that'd be the 400s. And this guy Nehemiah is portrayed as a Jewish figure who is sent by the Persians back to become the governor of this Judah province, Yehud, and who's allowed to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, which the Persians think is great because they want Jerusalem to be a fortified center for them, but not all the locals like very much. Although for them, of course, if the Persians want it, what are you going to do? And so the one intensive biblical look at this time is found in these two books, which are kind of related, Ezra and Nehemiah. And the thing to keep in mind for both of them is that they're very Jerusalem-centered. Ezra is really focused on the rebuilding of the temple, and Nehemiah is centered on the rebuilding of the walls, of the city walls of Jerusalem. They're both Jerusalem-focused. Now, what we're going to do today is end up looking at these documents that were, some of these documents that were found at the place called Elephantine. And Elephantine is not Jerusalem-focused, right? So it gives us an incredible opportunity to see an early Jewish community that's not defined by Jerusalem, that's not defined by the Bible, that's defined by something else. And you know, we don't have its own version of scriptures or its history of itself, but we have some legal documents and we have some letters that were sent. And mostly some of the letters would be what we put on Blackboard for you to take a look at, and we'll look at them again today. So given all of this, here's my goal for the day: to challenge our assumptions about the character of Judah communities after the end of the kingdom, and so about the origins of Judaism. To challenge our assumptions about the character of Judah communities after the end of the kingdom, and so about the origins of Judaism. Okay? So this is what I'm going to do with the rest of the time. I'm going to split it between two sets of texts. First, from the Bible, I want to put up a section from Nehemiah and just have us look at it together. And I'm going to ask you what you can see to help us get a way to define biblical expectations for early Judaism. Because if I said, well, what do you think the earliest Jewish communities looked like? You know, if you have a Jewish background, you may or may not have an opinion, a sort of sense of what it ought to look like, but you'd probably end up, in any case, resorting to the early biblical portrayals. But then if I say, well, how do you know the early biblical portrayals are either accurate in themselves or exhaustive? I mean, what if they're just one point of view? So let's get a sense of what that point of view is. And then we'll turn to the Elephantine stuff, because it's another point of view, and we want to kind of put the two side by side and see what we find. Okay, Mari, thanks. Nehemiah. That.
8 and 9, I cut and splice if you want.
Oh, okay. All right, so let's see. Well, I mean, since Mari went ahead and cut and spliced a little of 8 and 9.
Unless you want all of them.
No, this is fine. Well, so I mean, the thing that's gone on overall is that Nehemiah, the beginning of Nehemiah starts with this guy named Nehemiah who's still with the Persian king. And he's in the service of the Persian king in Persia, in Iran. And he is allowed to go back. In fact, it portrays him as initiating a request to go back and work for the Persians on behalf of his people, which would be those people of Judah. And in particular, he's hoping to restore the fortifications of the city of Jerusalem. And so he does successfully. It's a kind of long story. But afterward, there's this celebration and a sense that now the people of Judah are at least partially restored. They're not independent. They still are underneath the power of the Persian Empire, but there's a sense that if they've been given their city back, and the city has the temple of Yahweh in it, so that they can worship the way they were supposed to worship, then at least they can go about pleasing God the way they were supposed to please God according to their traditions of the Torah, books of Moses. A good question how old those traditions are, but you can see from this text that they're going to be imagined here. So there's this big gathering, and it kind of plays out in a long, drawn-out way. Presumably, Mari cut out the boring parts. Well, the more boring parts. I don't want to make any assumptions. All right. So all the people gather together into the square before the water gate. So this would be one of the gates of the city that they've now built. They told the scribe Ezra to bring the book of the law of Moses. So this is interesting, right? That the character Ezra, who is associated with the other book, is portrayed as being alive at the same time as Nehemiah and participating in the celebration arrangements for after the city's been restored. So he's supposed to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord, so Yahweh, had given to Israel. So the priest Ezra brings the law before the assembly, everybody who's there. This was on the first day of the 7th month, and he read from it, facing the square before the water gate, from early morning until midday. How long do you think that would take? I've never tried to do it. So, this is something to think about. If you had just the book of Genesis and you had to read it out loud, I don't know, you think you could do it in 3 hours? I don't know. But one of the questions, go ahead, yeah.
But if you were singing it, it wouldn't take a day.
No, but so it's a good question when you say if you're singing it. But it's a good question partly because if you think of sort of more modern traditions, then one of the questions is how much of this Torah really is being read, right? And this is the kind of thing where, I don't know, you could try reading it straight through and test it, but I haven't done that. So, but it's intriguing, right, that the story gives you a time framework to give you a sense for how much it is. So, early morning until midday, and the ears of all the people were attended to the book of the law, at least for that long. So then the scribe Ezra stood on a wooden platform, and beside him stand all these other guys. I don't know. I think you must have figured it would be awkward if you took all them out too, right? Or did you want me to read all of the names? And Ezra opened the book in the sight of all the people, for he was standing above all the people, and when he opened it, all the people stood up. And then Ezra blessed Yahweh, the great God, and all the people answered, Amen, lifting up their hands, and they bowed their heads and worshipped. And then it gives you a bunch more names. Levites helped the people to understand the law while the people remained in their places. So they read from the book, from the law of God, with interpretation. They gave the sense so that the people understood. It is a really interesting picture, isn't it? Because it not only implies that there is this section of the Bible, or at least Torah from Moses, but that not only does it have Ezra, who's kind of in charge of the whole thing, but it's got interpreters who are evidently, again, these Levites. So then, skipping a bit, well, it lists all these people and stuff like that. So, but she sort of sketched it down for us. Day by day, from the first day to the last day, he read the book of the law of God. They kept the festival 7 days. Now it's a question of whether that's how long it takes to get through the whole thing, or if they're going back through again and reading it again. We can't tell. But they start the chapter 9 now on the 24th day, because we start the first of the month, right? So on the 24th day of this month, the people of Israel were assembled with fasting, and those of Israelite descent separated themselves from all foreigners and stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of their ancestors. Sounds great if you happen to be married to one of these people, right? Okay, bye. Nice knowing you. They stood up in their place and read from the book of the law of the Lord. There they go again, and worship. And then, I don't remember, again, more lists and stuff probably through the middle of chapter 9. But I think chapter 9 includes a long prayer. No, it's okay. I'm just trying to remember what we're missing, right? Don't put it in there. Nehemiah, I think it's Nehemiah himself, goes into this long prayer, and he recapitulates their past history, and then comes down, this is where Mari picked it up, Now therefore, like given all this history, our God, do not treat lightly all the hardship that has come upon us. You have been just in all that has come upon us, right? Okay, we deserve it. For you have dealt faithfully and we have acted wickedly. Our kings, our officials, our priests, and our ancestors have not kept your law. And it goes on down until here. Here we are, slaves to this day, slaves in the land that you gave to our ancestors to enjoy its fruit and its good gifts. So for one, it's interesting in terms of the notion of a restoration that would go with the building of the temple and the building of the city walls. According to this prayer, they're not so positive about how great the arrangement is at this point. They are still slaves to a foreigner, and with this terrible irony, they're slaves in the very land that was supposed to be the gift of God, as the Bible story tells. So you get all the way through this prayer, and then to chapter 10, which is what I wanted to focus on. We can keep in mind this sort of backdrop. So you have this sealed document, and there's the name of Nehemiah the governor, and then it gives you all this down to here, 28. And it says, the rest of the people, so after you got the important ones who got their names in the Bible, the priests and the Levites and the gatekeepers and the singers and all this. So all these people join with their kin and enter into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law. This is the Torah, which was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord our Lord. So that's Yahweh our Lord and his ordinances. We will not give our daughters to the peoples of the land or take their sons for our daughters. If the peoples of the land bring in merchandise or grain on the Sabbath day to sell, we will not buy it from them. And then on it goes down. Take a look at this. I'm not going to read it out loud. So take a minute to read your way down to the bottom of the page. So here's my question for you as you look at this. And so keep in mind the stuff I sort of read through with you for background, and then look at this section. So if this is the picture of what might be called post-exilic Judaism, what is it? So what does it mean to be Jewish? As you'd see it here. What does it mean to be Jewish? Yeah.
They're kind of identifying themselves by going their own circles of having passed with God and all the people that came before them and the wickedness that happened and the stuff that happened to them and
That-
their lineage.
That is interesting. So for one, there's an identification in terms of the past, which is, that's very important. So what does it matter that it's what would be, like, why do that? Can they just not get over it? Like, this sounds like a good therapist in a modern setting would, like, you have to get beyond it, right? What is all this living through your ancestors?
Well, it gives into their culture and the way they think, and they place that highly. Maybe they can learn from it. Like they're saying they were wicked before, so these bad things happened, so we're not going to be wicked like they were.
So what does that mean? Like, so in a way, like, do you think that the people back then thought they were wicked? Or is it just these people are calling them wicked? They're calling them wicked. I mean, at least it's very possible that many of the people back in the defeated kingdom of Judah, or the kingdom of Judah pre-defeat, wouldn't have thought they were so wicked. And in a way, you could say, well, how do you know they were wicked? And the answer would be, because God punished them, right? Like, because he allowed his whole land to be dismantled. They must have been wicked. They must have displeased God, by definition. But it's a good question how they would have seen themselves. So, but then this becomes this is just following up on your idea about the past, identifying themselves by the past. But it's just so that you don't read what they write and assume that it's simply true, as if it's some obvious historical fact. Oh, they were wicked. What do you know about the people before 586? They were wicked. No, what you know from this text is that somebody who writes this book and his community thought of those people as wicked. They identify themselves with the past as descendants of people who somehow messed up on a massive scale. And what does that do for them? What does that mean? Do you follow? Like, okay, so you on one hand, you define yourself by your ancestors, but you don't think much of them. Yeah?
But there's like all the restoration and everything. It's like they're still cleaning up for the sins of the people that came before them.
Okay, so they're cleaning up for the sins of the people that came before them. But again, that's just what they think, right? Like they think of the people before them as, being sinful. What does this mean for who they are and how they live? Does it tell you in this text? So if they're cleaning up for the sins of the people before them, I propose to you that in this text, there are some details of what that cleanup might include.
The burnt offering, the grain offering.
Okay, burnt offering, grain offering, what are you thinking of?
Well, this is also biblical conception, but I guess returning to the state of purity that existed with the first temple.
Okay, returning to a state of purity that existed with the first temple. But that, of course, that's right. I mean,
That's what they think. I'm not saying.
yeah. So what would be that state of purity? I mean, it would.
I guess maintaining the terms of the Mosaic covenant.
Okay, so for one, there's this whole thing about sort of re-swearing a covenant or re-entering. It was somewhere up there. I mean, even enter a curse and oath to walk in God's Torah, right, His law. This is a kind of renewal of this covenant that's understood to come from Moses. So, what else do you see in here? Go ahead.
Now there's all these things they have to do before God all the time.
So what's on the list?
I mean, they have to bring often firstlings of their herd.
Yeah, so where was this? Down here, sort of firstlings of our herds and of our flocks.
Bring ourselves. We obligate ourselves to bring the first fruits of our soil, the first.
Yeah.
It's now we will not neglect the house of our God. Now
Right.
now there's these set up
So what is this?
rules that they have.
Okay, and these are religious rules, right? So, but I mean, not to be too obvious, right? So for one, this Jewish community, or Judah community, is being defined very much by religion, which maybe sounds obvious if you're Jewish in some ways, although interestingly, right, for even modern Jewish communities, the question is to what extent Jewish identity is connected to religion and to what extent it's somehow ethnic that doesn't require the participation in religion per se, or even necessarily that identification. And yet here they are at this point, choosing a very religiously defined identity out of a background in a kingdom where religion was a component, but not the defining thing. What were you, if you were a Judahite, what did that mean? It meant that you belonged to that land and its kingdom. And now they're choosing a very religious way of defining it. Religious, and I like the idea about being defined by the past. And then to add your idea, right, the notion of kind of fixing the past. That there's a sense that you have to identify yourself with the past, and yet the whole point of that almost seems to be to distance yourself from those people and distance yourself religiously. Now, what's underneath all of this? How shall I put this? What happens if you live in Babylon and you're Jewish, which we know a bunch of Jewish people did? What does this mean to you? How do you do it? What is this telling you to do? All this first fruit business. It says that you're supposed to bring it to God. Where do you bring it to God? Jerusalem, temple. So how do you think, how widely do you think this works? Yeah, go ahead.
And is it possible that they're asking those people to come?
It's a fair question. It's a fair question. Does it say, so on one hand it could be a sort of aliyah sort of invitation. Okay, now is your chance. Come back to the land.
Or maybe it's the opposite, that they're excluding the ones that
Or
aren't.
they could be excluding them? What do you think? Like when you see this, what happens if you aren't from there? Like how are you supposed to worship? Or how are you supposed to be Jewish if you don't live here? Or do they even care? Is it not even about the rest of them? Yeah?
I have a question. Was this like the Jews that were in other countries or other areas? Like, did they see this? Was this a letter?
Yeah.
Was this, like, did they see this 100
Would they even have seen the text? That's a really good question, and I don't even think we know the answer. I mean, at some point, we could imagine that the texts like this that got into the Bible would have been circulated more widely, but it seems to have been written by and for a community that was here. And it's got that feel, right? That, who knows where all the names come from, and we don't know if they're all real people, but it has the feeling, actually, of an actual community with all of these specific names and people who wanted to have their name, like on these war memorials almost, you get your name on the list. And so you're right. I mean, the text may really be a kind of in-house thing that just hasn't got anything to do with Babylonians. And yet, or, Jewish Babylonians, people from Judah who lived in Babylon. And yet, if this is what you say, like, we are the keepers of the covenant, and we're going to follow the old law of Moses, then is that kind of saying that the only way to be Jewish and follow the law of Moses properly is to belong to this community that's in the land and doing it right? We've now got our temple. Yeah.
I think it is, but I also could be making this up. I remember in chapter 7 or 8, there was something about following up the new, like, the restoration having to do with following this new spirit and, like, returning in, like, other ways. Like, it didn't say that it was, like, the time of, like, the synagogue, but didn't they also build, like, other, not like temples, but, like, other
Places of worship. I mean, it's not in this text, but for sure we know that in early Jewish tradition of the next few centuries up into Roman times, that one solution to this was the synagogue, was the notion that you could have a place where you could read biblical writing, especially Torah, but not necessarily only that. You could gather as a public community of Jews to worship together and to discuss things, to meet about whatever, and that you did not offer sacrifices because you could only do that at the temple. And this is where my knowledge breaks down in terms of what that meant for festival performance, but you couldn't really, so far as the festivals in their strict early sense involved making sacrifices. Like Passover was a sacrifice, and you couldn't make it. So you had to find workarounds at least. And so one of the questions that's out there is, in earliest Judaism, after the exile, then what was going on in these terms? Because Nehemiah doesn't say, I don't think, to go back to your observation or your question, Joe, about to what extent this is known. This text almost doesn't seem to care, right? Like, it's so in-house that it's just celebrating the return of some community and the reestablishment of a community of Jews in this place. And yet the implications seem to potentially invite to return, potentially exclude, say you can't do certain things if you're not here doing this. And, I don't know if that would be more sin if they went about trying to do it and they weren't here. And so here are all these ingredients, and there isn't reference to synagogue or other solutions, and there isn't reference to communities of Jews that live in other places, and we know they did from all sorts of later evidence. Okay, so let me just go through a couple more observations of my own and some sort of main ideas to get from it, and then we'll get to the Elephantini stuff. Notice the goal of communal separation, the whole marriage, intermarriage thing. This is a really big deal for them, and I'll come back to that in a second. Notice the explicit reference to Moses. If you're wondering, when is there a Bible? When is there a Torah that comes from Moses? By the time you get the writing of this book, you don't know for sure what was in it, but it took them a pretty long time to read, and they call it the Torah of Moses. And it seems to be associated with teaching within certain legal boundaries. Notice the emphasis on ritual that's shared. Part of what makes the community is the Sabbath observance, which is a weekly structure for time. and observance of festivals, which are on a more annual basis. And of course, notice the focus on the temple in Jerusalem. I have a list of some things that you could say would be absent from this. One of the things that struck me, Mari, is that David, they have this long recapitulation in the prayer. David is never mentioned. It's got this long thing about Moses, and then a little bit of reference that looks like it's the book of Judges, and then it jumps to prophets, right over David. Not even there. I don't know. Here's my list of the major things I want you to get. I've got 4 things. 1, being Jewish means coming from Judah. For this book, at least. Right? Being Jewish means coming from Judah, whether exiled or not. It doesn't worry about whether your family is still far away or not, but it's coming from Judah. There is a fear of losing that identity by marriage to outsiders. You think, what is the big deal about intermarriage? And it's the fear that again, if your identity as Jewish is coming from Judah, what happens when everybody marries other people so that that's not the identity? Now, if the identity was religious, absolutely religious, it was what you believed, then intermarriage wouldn't be so crucial, I think, as long as the people one marries agree to the beliefs that identify as Jewish. Any question about that, or does that make sense to you? Yeah. Second point. Jewish identity brings religious expectations of shared practice surrounding the single God, Yahweh. Now, maybe this sounds obvious again, but that's because we're used to it. So, if you're Jewish, you worship the God Yahweh together. So not just the temple, but the festivals and the Sabbath. So we'll bring that question to Elephantini too. All right, so you're from Judah, worship Yahweh together. Third, Jerusalem is the sacred center, marked by a Yahweh temple for all communal worship. So this Jerusalem temple is the center of the whole Jewish community's worship. In the world of this book, Jerusalem is the sacred center. And finally, the fourth is that a written tradition defined by Moses and the Torah creates a unifying authority, not identified with current leadership. This reminds me of your observation about identifying by the past, that one part of that is the notion of this book, the Torah, and its connection to Moses. And one interesting part of all this is that Nehemiah is the Persian governor, Ezra is the head priest, but the authority lies in the Torah, and there's a kind of communal adoption of that. And so there's no, for one, there's no king or attempt to have anything like a king. There's no single leader. But there's the temple, its priests, there's the Torah. Okay, ready for Elephantini? So my question for this Elephantini stuff, thank you. In fact, maybe we can do that first. Okay. Right. So here's modern Egypt. I don't know the history of this, and I looked briefly, but I didn't catch. So at some point when I was a kid, like 1960 or something, a little kid, there was this huge dam project that was undertaken, I think it was by Nasser in Egypt, called the Aswan Dam. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's the dam, oops, if we go back to the other one. It would be the dam, like pretty much right there above the site of Elephantine. And I don't know if there's a connection between the excavation and the dam building project. But pretty much Elephantine is on a little island in the middle of the Nile, right below the Aswan Dam. So, that Aswan, yeah. Okay, and the advantage of leaving some of this up here is that, so, I mean, there's Cairo, modern capital. Alexandria is this fabulously wealthy sort of Roman period city that was a port. But in the old time, Giza is where the big pyramids are that everybody knows about. And then, Luxor then down here is more this more ancient southern center of Egypt. And it's down there that the Valley of the Kings would be found, where at least a lot of the later kings were buried once they stopped using pyramids and they realized that pyramids are very impressive, but they're easy to break into. And that you're better off trying to hide your royal burials, which of course also didn't work very well, because if there's tons of gold at stake to find, then someone will always find a way to get to it. But I did get to go to Egypt once, and the Valley of the Kings is really cool because you can tell that they really tried to hide these things. I mean, if you imagine that they did it in the New Kingdom, which is the period we talked about with Amarna, right, and the Merenptah and so on. And this one, Tutankhamun, comes from that time. And this was Egypt's period of the greatest wealth, just fabulous wealth. And the kings embodied that wealth, and so much of it was buried with them. But they didn't want anybody to see it. So, they would go up these little valleys and build these little obscure holes in the ground. And then once you were underground, it would open up into these massive rooms with all sorts of fancy stuff found inside. And that's all kind of down here. So, in fact, while Elephantine is quite far inland, quite far south, it's not out in the sticks or something. It's just a bit farther upstream, farther south, than this whole old Valley of the Kings, Luxor sort of area. But the other thing that's worth noticing is that the next country to the south is Sudan, and this is what was Nubia in the old days. And Nubia was quite powerful, and the Egyptians had a kind of constant tension back and forth with the Nubians, sometimes trying to control them. There's at least one period where the Nubians kind of worked their way down the Nile and encroach into Egypt. And so if you think, what would you do with a military fortress or garrison on an island in the middle of the Nile, where this is, it would be to protect the core Egyptian territory against the Nubians. So that gives you a sense of what Elephantine is doing there. But also if you think, if you're Jewish or you're from Judah, how do you end up all the way down there? Not just one person, but a whole community. And this is a good question, because it's a long way from home. It's not like you just sort of start up there on the other side of the Sinai and go over to the Delta and it's kind of nearby. They're moving into a completely foreign landscape with completely foreign purposes for existence, and it appears they're doing so in service of the Persians, who are running the place. Okay, so now the text. Thanks, Mari. So my question is, what if we could tell what early Judah survivors really did? What if we could tell what early Judah survivors really did from an independent source? Like, what if we had something that was not the Bible to give us a sense of at least what one group really did? And the answer is that from one place, we can. We can actually get an independent view. And so here were these various letters and texts. And there's a set of these that were translated in this volume that was edited by a guy named James Pritchard. This guy, H.L. Ginsberg, is a super famous old scholar. He was the biblical scholar at Jewish Theological Seminary back through the 50s and 60s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And all these translations are by him. So this is what I want you to do. I'm going to sort of have us look at 4 or 5 of these texts. And as we go, I want you to answer, I want you to jot down notes to answer the following questions. Where do these people come from? And why are they here? Where do these people come from? Can you tell? What is their identity? How do they think of themselves? And how can you tell? For example, do you think they come from Jerusalem? Like, so it's not, you can say, oh, well, that's easy. They're from Judah. Well, of course, I want, I want you to be able to tell me how you can tell they're from Judah, if they are. But can you tell anything else about them? Where they're from? So if you look on the upper right-hand side, there's this bit, when we get to that text, comprising for Yahweh, which is going to be like Yahu, like without the eh at the end. YHW without the H at the end. So for Yahweh, 12 something or others, karash, some amount of these things. 6 shekels. For Ishum Bethel, 7 karash. For Anat Bethel, 12 karash. That's just as many as for Yahweh. Who are these characters? So I want you to help me. What's going on with these characters? Then eventually you're going to see petition for authorization to rebuild the temple of Yahweh. What does this temple information tell you? Right? So when we get to that temple, what are you learning about these people? And then, don't turn, but on the next page there's going to be a long letter which involves this whole complicated request to celebrate the festival of unleavened bread, which is connected to the Passover. So what are you learning about the people from this exchange? Okay, so here we go, right? So first, I'm going to have you do the first one, the second one. So this is the one that ends up with those characters. We're going to skip the claim by oath thing. Then we're going to go down to this petition for the authorization and go to the long text that follows. All right, so to my brethren, Yedaniah, well, we kind of know because he's involved in a bunch of the other texts. The brackets are where the text is broken. And his colleagues, the Jewish garrison, your brother Hananiah, the welfare of my brothers, may God seek at all times. Now this year, the 5th year of King Darius, word was sent, saying, authorize a festival of unleavened bread for the Jewish garrison. So do you count 14 days of the month, Nisan, and observe the Passover. Now, of course, that's not actually in the text, so we don't know. And from the 15th to the 21st day of Nisan, observe the festival of unleavened bread. Be ritually clean and take heed. Do no work on the 15th or the 21st day, nor drink beer. Don't want any beer. Nor eat anything in which there is leaven from the 14th at sundown until the 21st of Nisan. For 7 days it shall not be seen among you. Do not bring it into your dwellings, but seal it up between these dates, by order of King Darius. To my brothers, Yedaniah and the Jewish garrison, your brother Hananiah. Okay? So I hope you got something about these Jews. Now notice this next one. All this is more an administrative text. On the 3rd of something or other, right, year 5, it's the same year 5 of Darius. This is the names, these are the names, of the Jewish garrison, which gave money to the god Yahweh. And then it says, lines 2 to 119. I think maybe we won't translate them. 126 to 135. Name 123 contributors of both sexes. And then tucked in between, because remember it said it goes to 119 and then 126 to 135. Tucked in between this 120 to 125, cash on hand with Jedaniah the son of Gemariah, evidently the same person, on the said day of the month. And then it counts these three amounts. So this entire text, big community, 123 community contributors, and it starts with Yahweh, and the whole thing is listed this way: the names of the Jewish garrison which gave money to the god Yahweh. And yet, when it talks about it, it gives you three figures. What's going on? All right, so then the next one. To our Lord Bagoas, governor of Judah, your servants, Jedaniah, there he is again, and his colleagues, probably brothers, the priests who are in the fortress of Elephantine, may the God of heaven seek after the welfare of our Lord, and all it goes. Let's go to the next page. This is this long text. So it talks about in the 14th year of King Darius, when Arsames departed and went to the king, the priests of the god Canub, who was in the fortress of Elephantine, conspired with this character, Vidaranag, who was commander-in-chief here, to wipe out the temple of the god Yahweh from the fortress of Elephantine. So that wretch, Vidanarag, sent to his son Nephion, who was in command of the garrison of the fortress of Syene, this order: the temple of the god Yahweh in the fortress of Yeb is to be destroyed. So this guy leaves Egyptians, other troops, so they come down, they enter the temple, and they razed it to the ground, right? Smashed it, burned it. The stone pillars that were there, they smashed. 5 great gateways built with hewn blocks of stone, which were in the temple, that they demolished. But their doors are standing. And the hinges of those doors are bronze. Go through all the stuff. Whatever else there was, they burnt with fire. They take all this stuff, basins of gold and silver. Now our forefathers built this temple in the fortress of Elephantine back in the days of the kingdom of Egypt. And when Cambyses came to Egypt, he found it built. They knocked down all the temples of the gods of Egypt, but no one did any damage to this temple. But when this happened, so did you get that when it says, when they knocked down all the temples of the gods of Egypt? Who knocked down? Do you see? Well, who said it? Persians, right? So this is Cambyses, right? So Cambyses is the Persian who takes over Egypt. So this is, I don't know where you're going to put this in your sense of what's going on, but he's now saying the temple was already there when the Persians came. They left it alone. And that's going to be part of his argument, that the Persians had no problem with this before. So they did no damage. But when this happened, we and our wives and children wore sackcloth and fasted and prayed to Yahweh, the Lord of heaven. So what they're requesting is a fresh start. It says we've also, this is down here now, we've sent a letter before when this evil was done to us. A little back and forth. From the month of Tammuz, year 14 of King Darius, to this day we have been wearing sackcloth and fasting. Also from then to now, in the year 17 of King Darius, no meal offering, incense, or burnt offering has been offered. Now your servants, Jedaniah and his colleagues, and the Jews, the citizens of Elephantine, all say, thus, if it please our Lord, take thought of this temple to rebuild it, since they do not let us rebuild it. Look to your well-wishers and friends here in Egypt. Let a letter be sent from you to them concerning the temple of the god Yahweh, to build it in the fortress of Elephantine as it was built before, and the meal offering, incense, burnt offering will be offered in your name, and we shall pray for you at all times, we and our wives and our children, all the Jews who are here, if you do thus, so that the temple is rebuilt. And you shall have merit before Yahweh the God of heaven, more than a man who offers him burnt offerings and sacrifices. Because of this we have written to inform you. We have also set the matter forth in a letter in our name to Delaiah and Shelemiah, the sons of Sanballat, the governor of Samaria. That's the old capital of Israel. And then that's it. Also, Arsames knew nothing of all that was done to us, and then it gives a date. I'm going to skip the last couple. This is the most famous text. All right, so any surprises here? Anything you learn about being Jewish in Elephantini that would be a little bit difficult to fit with being Jewish in Jerusalem according to the book of Nehemiah? What do you have? Yeah.
Well, there seems to be, I'm not sure if it's necessarily an acceptance, but there are other deities that are mentioned in that text.
So this is, which would this be?
The shekels.
Yeah, back up. We'll back up. Yeah, the payment.
And it says that there are people, I guess, who are living in Elephantini who are giving money to other deities aside from Yahweh.
So this is really important to notice, and it wouldn't fit into Nehemiah very well, right? Did everybody read this? Do you figure these are gods? So, I mean, pretty much we have to go up to the top there. Ishum Bethel and Anat Bethel. Are they gods? I'm not saying they're not. How do you know what they are? What's Bethel? Anybody? Ring a bell? Bethel's come up in this class, and it's not been the center of attention. It's a city. Do you remember where? Which country it's in? Like between Israel and Judah? Do you not remember? It's at the sort of southern end of Israel. It would have been part of Israel. Yeah, so it's a town. So then the question is, Ishum Bethel. Of course, you have to think, well, what's Ishum and what's Anat? Now, Anat's funny because if you go back to Ugarit, Anat is the young goddess, the young kind of warrior goddess of Ugarit. And so that's kind of funny, whether it means, Anat of Bethel, or like the Anat of Bethel, like a town. So here's a proposal to run by you. So a couple of scholars have suggested that because these two figures, if they're gods or whatever, mention Bethel and are named by Bethel, then this must imply that the people of Elephantini are not from Judah, or at least partly not from Judah. They're from Israel, because these things mention Bethel, which is not only a city, but it's a sacred city in Israel. The book of Amos makes Bethel the focus of a whole set of prophecies against the northern kingdom. So would this work for you? Like, so if you read everything we've got here, right? So if there was that long letter, how about my identity question? How are these people identified? How do they identify themselves? Who are they? What do they call themselves? It's a Jewish garrison, yeah?
First they just say military garrison, but then they specifically say Jewish garrison. So
yeah.
That's like, I guess they're connected to the other Jewish people in Israel in some way, as if they ventured out together as like this group.
Yeah, so I mean, at least I think that in every one of these texts, it uses the term Jewish, which he's translating that way, but which would mean the Judah garrison in a sense, right? It's the same thing, people from Judah. I mean, here it's at the beginning and the end. His colleagues, the Jewish garrison, and the end to my brethren, Yedaniah and the Jewish garrison, and then the next one, it's the names of the Jewish garrison which gave money, and then this one is going to be, I don't know if it comes up yet, but I'm almost sure on this. Here, go to the next page. Somewhere in here. Help me find it. Jewish garrison must be in here. There's all this stuff there's stuff about that. Now your servant, this is the top of the right-hand column, your servants, Yedaniah and his colleagues and the Jews, the citizens of Elephantini. So, I mean, at that point, they're the Jews, the Judahites, whatever, right? That's who they are. So they think they're Jews and Judahites. Would that work if they're from Israel? Like, how do you fit? This is partly why I gave you the dates I did at the beginning. How would this work that you could have Jews who are actually from Israel? Yeah?
Well, I think it makes And so it would make sense, I'm not positive if people from Judah would have been in Elephantine at the time, because the temple already existed before the Persians came in.
Yeah, so that's a good line of thought, right? So one possible way you could get it would be to say that it's actually some community that was around even before 586, right? That would have been people who moved out of Israel straight to Egypt. Now, a couple of potential problems with that, and it's not totally clear what the answer is that, for one, they call themselves Judahites. They actually don't call themselves Israelites or Sumerians or something like that. They call themselves Judahites over and over again. And when they want to get permission to rebuild their temple and to have sacrifices there and to perform festivals there, they write to the governor of Judah in order to get that permission. And they have this whole back and forth that plays out in a couple more letters about what the leadership at Jerusalem thinks is okay for them to do. So they seem to treat the authorities in Judah as the primary authority with which they identify. So this is a kind of weird thing. I think you had a good idea. But if you just took this at face value, they look like they're from Judah. One possible explanation for this that may be more detailed than you need, but it turns out that this term Bethel is, especially in this later period, applied to stones that you would use in worship. Matzevot is the Hebrew. And this is what becomes a Greek word that's borrowed from the Hebrew and Phoenician, which means sort of house of God or place of God, something like that. And we know that in Greek, they had this term, which was baitelos, which is from Bethel, that meant a stone which marks the presence of a god. And so one thing that I wondered was whether these are maybe not other gods per se, but it's a little bit like the Asherah discussion that we had. And we're dealing with some kind of representations of divine power that are part of Yahweh's worship, Yahweh's temple there, especially because at the beginning the whole thing is that they gave money to the god Yahweh and for his temple, evidently. So it seems like they're all part of a package. So for one, if it is this Bethel, then it's not then just that it then might not be other gods. It might be an object or two objects. But of course, then also Bethel would not be the place. So you don't have to worry about the whole Israelite thing at all if this alternate explanation were true. Okay, so anyway. Now let me just, I have three big items, things that I want you to notice. So survivors from Judah, as far as southern Egypt, did remain a distinct community. And this is striking, right? With all of that Nehemiah worry about intermarriage and losing your ethnic identity. So here's this group of people from all the way down in southern Egypt who have remained a Jewish garrison. So if it's some group of fighters, somebody that the Persians have hired to support their southern frontier, they've been hired as a community with their families and everything. And they're staying together as Jews. And this is still all part of this first point, they did so in part by the worship of Yahweh. They built themselves a temple. Like, what better way to stay Jewish and to keep your ethnic identity when you move to southern Egypt than to build your own temple and have sacrifices and have festivals and observe the Passover and the Sabbath? It sounds great, doesn't it? Except for that the people at Jerusalem would have hated the idea. Which is kind of funny then to realize that, of course the synagogue thing maybe works out as a later solution, but that to go ahead and worship Yahweh and build your own temple and have your own sacrifices in your foreign place that you're forced to go would be a great way to keep your Jewish identity. And in some ways, the Jerusalem people, by saying, no, 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 only Jerusalem's temple, you can't do it anywhere else, is maybe a bad strategy. Right? It at least puts the Jews who are far away in a difficult position. Like, do you have to go back? Like, you have to go back to Jerusalem, which is maybe just not possible, never mind. It may not be legal, right? That under the empire, they're not letting Jews just move around and go wherever they want. The whole story in Ezra and Nehemiah portrays the Jews there as having to get permission from the imperial power to go back. They can't just say, I mean, if we can raise the money, we make the trip. They have to get permission, and they probably can't return, most people. So for one, I want you to notice, I think that we really do have a Jewish community in Elephantine. So you can't get out of the tensions in the definition of this by saying, well, maybe they're not really Jewish. Second point, they gave Jerusalem special respect, but expected to reproduce full worship by a temple, sacrifice, and ritual in the distant land. So kind of got ahead of myself before, right? So, but they do seem to recognize Judah as the old special starting place. And you can get a sense that they really are from Judah by the fact that they write to the officials in Jerusalem to say, well, this is what we want to do. It's just like what you do. Is that okay? And then finally, the third large point at least, is that there's no sign of a Bible authority. So when they're trying to work out what to do, there's no sign that they have a Bible, that they have Torah. Again, to go back to your question about Nehemiah, who had access to this. I mean, never mind that. For these guys, it's not clear that they have access to Torah. In order to know what they can do, they write letters back to the people who do have it. And even then, they're not asking about Moses. They just want to be in sync with what's going on at Jerusalem. So this is just a little bit of a glimpse of how different the landscape can be. They can have another temple. They can include in the worship of that temple these figures, Ishum Bethel and Anat Bethel. They negotiate long distance over how to make that align with what's going on at Jerusalem. But they have their own Jewish life. And it doesn't sound like they're building it around Torah or around the Bible, but they do have a strong sense of Jewish identity. So in the end, unified Judaism had to be created among communities through the first centuries after the kingdom ended. That's really the main thing to notice, that it was not just a kind of automatic survival from the kingdom of Judah. All they had to do was hold on to what they had. No, they really had to forge it from the new situations. See you on Wednesday. But then there's this question, so after 586, or the first defeat earlier in the 599, 597, after that moment, how many people go to Babylonia? How many people stay in the land? Where else do people go? At least some of them go to Egypt. And what does that mean that they're scattered? Next date, 539. So this is only 50 years later. No, what? Yeah, 50, roughly. So this is when this guy named Cyrus, C-Y-R-U-S, Cyrus, sets up, he takes over Babylonia and the Babylonian Empire, and sets up what's usually called a Persian Empire. And in some ways, it seems that the King Cyrus initiates new policies toward the people they conquered. And it's probably not true that they're friendlier exactly, but at least in the case of Judah, the Persians could say, well, it wasn't our rebellion. They didn't rebel against us. We're going to manage these people in a different way, still controlling them, but with our own idea of what should work. And in particular, what the Persians seem to do is they encourage the establishment of certain institutions in Jerusalem, which had been the capital. Right? Jerusalem was the capital of Judah, and the Persians set up a province that is usually called in Aramaic, which was the national language, Yehud, Y-E-H-U-D. It's the same word. Judah is Yehudah, and so it simply takes the last ah off. So they, in effect, set up a province of Judah with Jerusalem as the capital, and they say, let them rebuild that temple there. This will be good for us, for the empire. And then eventually let them rebuild the walls, the city walls. We have no problem with Jerusalem as a fortified center, because it'll be our fortified center. And the head of Judah will be our governor, working for us. We're not worried about a rebellion. But in terms of our Elephantine stuff and kind of the backdrop of what happens after the exile, after the fall of Judah, then the arrival of the Persians is a huge thing. Okay, I got a fourth date. 526. Cyrus's son, whose name is Cambyses, or however it should be pronounced, C-A-M-B-Y-S-E-S, Cambyses, conquers Egypt. In 526, the Persians conquer Egypt. And that's going to affect Elephantine, because that's when we're going to get this community. And the Persians hold Egypt till about 400, so about 125 years. If you think about it, this is a long way from the center of Persia, which is in Iran. So all the way across Iraq and Syria and sort of Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, all the way down into Africa. This is a big empire at this point, bigger than any of the Assyrian Babylonian ones. Never mind that it reached way further into the east. And I have one more date and then a kind of vague statement about what happens after. So according to the Bible at least, in about 515, in about 515, a temple is rebuilt at Jerusalem under King Darius, D-A-R-I-U-S, Darius the First. So the reason that ends up being interesting is that it appears there was a temple in Egypt. And so it'd be useful to know how that relates to the temple in Jerusalem. So the last thing just to throw out there by way of background is that the Bible has two books that are oriented to this situation under the Persians. And they're the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And there's a lot of debate about exactly when they were written, how much they really know historically, what kinds of historical sources they had. But they spend some time occupied with the temple rebuilding, especially Ezra, which would be kind of late 6th century, though the text itself is surely later, or at least large parts of it. But also then they're occupied with events that seem to take place in the 5th century, so that'd be the 400s. And this guy Nehemiah is portrayed as a Jewish figure who is sent by the Persians back to become the governor of this Judah province, Yehud, and who's allowed to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, which the Persians think is great because they want Jerusalem to be a fortified center for them. But not all the locals like very much. Although for them, of course, if the Persians want it, what are you going to do? And so the one intensive biblical have gone to Judah. And at least I conclude this because the Bible is so full of stories about Israel. And this is where the Israel-Judah framework came in terms of my own book project that's waiting to come out. That Judah somehow inherits a huge pile of lore from Israel, the other kingdom. And for that to happen, you've got to have people from Israel going into Judah. Second date, and again this is kind of a combo date, 597, 586, defeat of Judah. Again, maybe sounds obvious, but the question that affects us is, what happens to these people? What happens to the people of Judah after 586? And again, the Bible says some mass of them get deported to Babylon, Babylonia. But it's not all of them. And in fact, if you want to read the most detail on this in the Bible, go to a few chapters toward the end of the book of Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah. And we're told that the Babylonians set up a local governor. And Jeremiah kind of sides with this local governor, but then these people come along and they assassinate the Babylonian governor, which turns out not to make the Babylonians very happy. And so they take off, and the place that they go is Egypt, it says. And that's a little backdrop for our Elephantini stuff. And the last thing you hear about Jeremiah himself, in fact, is that he's been dragged off to Egypt with these people that assassinated a guy named Gedaliah, the governor the Babylonians set up. For today, I called this Elephantini and Jewish identity. And before I even get to what I called my goal for the day, I wanted to give you just a little background information. And to some extent, the two-page project that had you look at the chapter in the history before the exile and after the exile kind of sets you up for this. But let me pull out about 5 big dates, 5 or 6 big dates. And overall, the class isn't about dates, but if you don't get certain details regarding dates, then you kind of won't know what's going on when we get to Elephantini. So the first date that matters, and this may be a little bit of a surprise, it's so far back, is the 722-720 date. And those 2 dates were the fall of Samaria, the northern kingdom, capital of the northern kingdom, and then the establishment of Assyrian control there. But this is the defeat of Israel. And the reason why the date is important is that you have to ask, what happens to these people? And so after 720, does everybody just keep going to the grocery store and doing their errands and getting their kids from school and life goes on? Or surely there were some huge disruptions. And what were they? The Bible describes some large portion of people being deported to areas in the Assyrian kingdom, not to Assyria itself, but they just move the population around so they won't be at home. And they move other people from other parts of their empire into this area. But one thing to keep in mind is that some part of those people from Israel must